Hi guys, this is Lauren with Lauren Watkins Art, and today we are going to be painting this spooky jack-o'-lantern. So this is our reference photo, and then here is your drawing guide that you can use as an aid to help you draw, or you can screenshot it, print it, and trace it if you want. But once you get your image onto your watercolor paper, you are ready to prep your paints. So before I start painting, I always like to get my paints ready to roll. That way my paper stays nice and wet. The colors we're going to be using are burnt sienna, so that is the brown color you see, violet, ultramarine blue, phthalo green, cadmium red, gamboge, and cadmium yellow light. The gamboge is just a warmer yellow color, so you just need to find a yellow that leans a little bit more orange and a yellow that is a little bit more lemony. And don't worry about my burnt sienna kind of flowing into my violet. I'm going to be mixing those two colors anyways, so it wasn't a big deal. Here I am getting my yellows prepped. It's not too particular. Like if you only have one yellow, it's fine. I just used a mixture of both because sometimes I just make things more complicated than they need to be. But I've got both my yellows going, and I'm not really mixing at this point. I'm just getting them all prepped and ready to roll. I will be pulling out the green and the violet a little bit later, but these are my starting colors. So blue, brown, violet, and then our two yellows. And then I sprayed my paper to get it nice and wet, and now I'm just taking my paintbrush and spreading that water around to really get it saturated, because by working on really wet paper, that is going to allow those paints to kind of flow and move and give you that really nice washy feel that you get with watercolors. And you really want your paper soaked so that it will stay wet and give you a little bit longer of a working time. The paper I am using is Strathmore 400, so it's not a cotton paper that stays wet for a long time, so I have to work a little bit more quickly. If you are working on a student grade paper, I highly recommend watching this through and then following along, just so you have a feeling for how the paints will work. So while I was talking, I got a little bit of green in my yellow, and so I added a little bit of red to that to counteract the green undertones of it and kind of made an orange color, which I'll be using in a minute. And then I just reactivated. I made another spot that was just yellow. And so I could do my base yellow color, and now just coming in with my more orangey tones. You can see by how shiny my paper is, it's still really wet. And if your paints aren't flowing or moving on your paper, you can use your paintbrush to kind of help move that paint around. Your paints flow and move based off of the quality of paints you're using and the quality of paper you're using. So if your paints aren't flowing or blending, you might just need to kind of give it a little nudge. Once I got the base yellow tone in, then I started in with an orange color. So I just mixed a little bit of cadmium red and the two yellows that were in the well. Okay, so just a yellow, and then we're going over with orange. The yellow, I put it all the way inside the mouth. I did leave a little white highlight in the eyes and in the mouth, and then I added that pale yellow. And now I'm coming in with the orange, and I'm just not bringing it in as into the eye, as far into the eye and the mouth as I did with the yellow. So I'm just being a little bit more careful, working around that area, going around all the little points on the nose, or not on the nose, he doesn't have a nose, on his mouth, and just blocking that in. And then I'm going to go straight in with our burnt sienna and violet, and I'm just mixing those together, and I'm going to add another layer to start building up that kind of dark, foggy atmosphere that was in our reference photo. And I'm moving very, very quickly. This is in real time, so I am moving fast. That's why I prepped all the paints, getting it all in. You might have to activate more paints as you go along, but by having some paints ready to roll, it really does help keep you moving quickly when you need your paper to stay wet. So I didn't bring that violet and brown mixture onto the pumpkin other than the stem. So you can see we're kind of working our way out and gradually building a little bit of a halo around our pumpkin. Now I'm taking burnt sienna and our ultramarine blue, which makes a really good gray color. And then I'm mixing those together. This one leans a little bit more brown, and then I added a little bit of violet to it, just to help bring in some of the warmth and some of the undertones we were already using. And now I'm starting to block this in. And you can see I'm not even being very fussy with my brush strokes. I'm kind of having them fan out in all different directions. That way it can kind of lean into that like foggy, mysterious background effect that isn't too structured or organized. And then I started to run out of paint, so I mixed up some more. Again, just ultramarine blue, violet, and our burnt sienna. And just adding a little bit of water to help that move and flow and to lighten it up. Remember, with watercolor, if you need to make something lighter in value, you need to add more water to it. This is a little bit darker of a mix than the other layer I added, and I'm just helping spread and move that around. Part of the reason why I like burnt sienna and ultramarine blue together is when it dries, you get a more interesting color variation, because the ultramarine blue is a granulating color, and so it can kind of separate from the brown when it dries, and so you get this kind of multi-dimensional and color effect with it. My paper started to dry, and so I just misted it with a light mist of water, and then I took a paper towel and I just am randomly starting to blot up some of that color to lighten it up just a smidge, okay? And it's helping to create a little bit more of an unorganized, a little more chaotic color distribution as well, to really start to get that kind of fog effect within the picture. And now I've mixed up another dark color. So it's the same ultramarine blue, violet, and burnt sienna. And then I added Paynes gray. I forgot Paynes gray in my list of colors. But Paynes gray to really start getting those colors really, really dark. And I am not bringing this really dark color into the center quite as far as the other colors. So you can see that halo effect really starting to form within the picture. I'm just mixing up a little bit more. The type of paints I'm using, I am using Vinci. The only color on this palette that isn't Vinci is the sap green color. I am making my brush strokes that are kind of like on the table or the ground area run a little bit more horizontally, so left to right instead of up and down, just to give the appearance of the pumpkin sitting on some type of table or floor or something along those lines. So those strokes are starting to be a little bit more directional in an intentional way, and just starting to create maybe the feel of some wood or something by having my brush strokes run that direction. I am keeping little gaps where you can see the earlier layers poking through. That's going to help create the effect of some light or glowing from the pumpkin appearing on the table. And then I'm again just dabbing up with the paper towel in kind of a random pattern to kind of bring that texture to the background. Now I'm mixing up some orange, and I'm going to work on the pumpkin a little bit more. So the orange I mixed up, it was just our yellow. I think I used our Gamboge and then a little bit of our Cadmium Red to make an orange, because yellow and red make orange. And now I'm taking a small paintbrush and just running that around our eye. And you can see the little lines within the eye. Those just kind of mark where the hollow area of the pumpkin is versus where kind of the cut flesh of the pumpkin is versus the exterior of it. And I ran that orange on the kind of cut section and then around the whole eye. And since the pumpkin's a little bit wet, it is going to move and flow just a bit. Now I'm just blocking in some teeth. Again, just using my small paintbrush, going around the mouth, and then having my brush strokes kind of follow along with the shape of the mouth and the direction of the teeth. And don't be discouraged if it takes you longer to paint this. This is like my third time practicing this painting. This is actually for one of my intermediate watercolor classes. And so I did a practice run, and then I needed to simplify it for the class. And so I tried it again and then wanted to tweak kind of my approach on it. And so this is the third iteration of that painting. So having done it 3 times, I became a little bit quicker with doing it. Now I'm just taking that orange and filling in this pumpkin, the whole rest of the pumpkin with our orange color. I am keeping my brush strokes a little bit more intentional in the direction while I'm doing the pumpkin. So I'm having them follow the curves of the pumpkin, so following the curve of the edges, and just really paying attention to the direction I'm laying down my color in. That is going to help create that dimension within our picture and help it seem more round. When you are painting things, you want your brush strokes to follow the shape or the curve of the object and however you want it to appear. So now I'm filling in the center area, and I'm still using an orange, but it leans a lot more yellow. And the reason why I'm doing this is this face area of the pumpkin is glowing a lot more in the final piece, and it's not as dark. And so I'm starting to build up that effect. So I'm having it be a more brighter yellow in the center and then go a little bit more orange towards the edges. And since I am working on a wet paper, what is happening is the background's dried a little bit. So my paints aren't like flowing out of the area of the pumpkin. But since some of those layers on the pumpkin, that happens to be orange in color, are wet. So those colors are kind of mixing on the paper. And it's not a big deal here because these colors all go together. But if I was going to be doing lots and lots of layers of paint and really start getting the glazing techniques and things like that, then I would let it dry between each layer. So if you don't want your paints to like mix together on the paper, let your paper dry between each layer. I've had students where they're like, I keep putting down color, but it keeps lifting it up and it's suddenly getting lighter. And what's happening is they've painted an area, it's dried probably 75% of the way, and then they go in to put another layer of paint down. And what happens is the paint that they've already laid down lifts off of the paper and starts mixing with what they were laying down. And so they get kind of these weird light spots and halo effects. So if you don't want your colors to move and flow and blend together, or your paper is like 90% of the way dry or mostly dry and just kind of damp to the touch, just let it dry 100% of the way, and then you can go back in and do more layers more easily. Watercolor I found does best if you're either like wet into wet and you're working with lots of wet paint and lots of wet layers, and then you can add more to it as it dries, but there's a certain point where you kind of just have to let it dry all the way before you do more layers. So it's a good time to take a break or get out your blow dryer and dry your paper all the way if you're impatient. Go eat lunch, things like that. Just let your paper dry, and so it no longer feels cool to the touch. So what I did on this background is I painted the pumpkin, and then I let the whole paper dry completely, speaking of what we were just talking about. And now I'm going in and re-wetting this background. Now, if you are going to be doing this, especially if you're re-wetting quite a bit like I am, you need to make sure you're being very soft with how hard you're pushing down on your paper. And if you have a brush that's a very soft texture, that's a better option. Really stiff paint brushes, especially like the ones with like the golden bristles, those can really be hard on your paper and they can really lift off the other paints. The paintbrushes I'm using are very, very, very soft, and so they hold a lot of water, so I don't have to re-dip as much. And the nice thing is they are very soft, so they don't activate the other paints underneath. Think of it as a scrub brush. When you have a scrub brush and you rub it over a dirty pan, it really is going to pick up a lot more of the dirt and grime that's built up on the pan than if you had a very smooth piece of fabric that you wiped over it. That would just kind of bounce across the top of all the stuff you're trying to scrub off. So when you use a really stiff paintbrush and you are rubbing it on your paint that you've already let dry or across your paper, it's going to be quite abrasive on it. So it's going to pick up those paints, and it can also scratch up your paper and have it start to peel and kind of fall apart. Not saying you can't use those brushes, but you just have to be really, really soft with your touch with them on the paper. So I blocked in some more color in the areas that I've wetted, and I am adding a little bit of like orangey yellows to the base where you can see kind of the light being cast from the pumpkin or reflected onto the table, just kind of blocking some of that in. And then I'm mixing some more darks with our Paynes gray, violet, and burnt sienna. Doing our horizontal brush strokes along the bottom. If I'm getting things too dark or harsh around the edges where I don't want them to be because I want to keep that kind of fog effect, then I'm just blotting it with my paper towel. One thing to note, watercolors tend to dry lighter in value than what they appear wet. And so you might get your colors perfect and then you go do something and you come back to your picture and it's way too light. So you might have to do another layer or two of paint to get that value as dark as you want. So just something to keep in mind. So I am mixing up some green, and I had some phthalo green over on the side of my palette that's just off screen. And then I went to dip into the yellow, and I accidentally dipped into my lighter green color. So I rinsed it off and picked up some orange or some Gamboge, so my orangey yellow, and mix those together to start to block in the stem of our pumpkin. And then I took just a little bit of our burnt sienna violet gray mix that we've been using for the background and just started adding this to the stem to kind of knock back some of the vibrancy and to start to darken up the values. And you can see a little bit of like bleeding that happened because the background was still wet when I put it in. It wasn't bleeding enough for me to like really worry about it, so I just let it be. If you have paints kind of flowing strongly into the wrong areas of the paper, you can just dab it up with a paper towel and then let your paper dry. Because that's one of the things people struggle with watercolors is their paints are going in areas that they're not supposed to, and that comes from your paper being too wet. Your paints will go wherever it's wet. So if you are painting something and it touches another wet area, your paints you add will flow into that area. If you don't want your paints to flow or move or go somewhere that they're not supposed to, let your paper dry and then work in that area. So I mixed up an orange color and again just yellow and red, the same red we've been using the whole time. I think I'm using Gamboge, but it really doesn't matter which yellow you're using at this point. And I am just deepening up the values around the eyes to really start to build that gradient so it looks like they're glowing and starting to get that feeling on the picture. One thing to keep in mind is something that's really going to make a big difference on this painting is making sure we're getting our values right. So in order to make it look like the eyes are glowing, there's a light coming out of them, we need to make sure Those areas are bright, and then the other areas are dark enough to really get that glowing effect. It's the same with kind of that foggy background it has. We need to make sure we get the texture and the values correct. So the texture is kind of that wispy feel that isn't too like structured. And that's what we were doing with kind of the halo layering and then the dabbing with the paper towels and then getting the areas around it dark enough so that those highlighted areas pop out enough. If you are struggling with knowing what areas to get darker or what areas to make lighter, one tip I would really recommend is take your reference photo, have the color version, but then also take it and turn the saturation down so that you can see what it looks like black and white. Then on your own painting, you can take a picture of your own painting and make it black and white, and then you can compare the values of your painting versus the reference photo. And that will help you see, oh, I need to make this area darker, or I need to make this area lighter. And you can really start to see kind of what you need to focus on, because you can paint any object, any color, and it will look like that object. The biggest thing is getting those values and the shapes correct. Okay, you can paint a pink cow and everyone will know it's a cow based off of the shapes and then the values, because the values will help make it look more dimensional. Now I'm just working around the mouth, again with that same orange color, just starting to build up the shape, and I'm just keeping my brush strokes lining up with the shape of the mouth. So on the lower area of the mouth, I had the brush strokes kind of go straight back towards the center of the pumpkin and kind of fade out, so it looks like it's the cut edges. And then I'm being careful with the direction that I'm doing around the top of the mouth as well. Then I made a darker orange color, so a little bit more red and less yellow. And I am just very carefully falling right on the very edges of the mouth and the high points on the cuts that kind of show all the different teeth. I am just using a smaller paintbrush for this. If a paintbrush that I'm using is too big for you to do something comfortably, always feel free to go down to a smaller paintbrush. This is just something that can come from control and experience using paintbrushes. The more you use paintbrushes, the more control and comfortable you feel using them. So then you don't have to use quite as small paintbrushes. But as you're developing those skills, if I am doing something with a giant paintbrush and you're like, whoa, I don't have enough control to do that fine of detail with it, always feel free to size down. Okay. So now I'm taking that dark orange and then going around the very edges of the eye so we can start to get, again, more of that glowing look to our pumpkin. And I'm just taking my time. And when you're working, if you're having a hard time doing something or reaching an area and having control, feel free to turn your board around or move it or kind of hold it vertically to you so you can see it a little bit better. Don't be afraid to like move your paper around. That's why I always tape it to a board so I can move it. It's just tricky to move it when I'm filming it. So I tend to keep mine more stationary when I'm filming, but when I'm working and I'm not filming, I will move or flip the picture, angle it a different way, whatever it takes to kind of help me be able to paint the way I want to paint. Now I'm mixing kind of a dark brown color. It has burnt sienna, cadmium red, and our violet. So it's kind of this reddish brown color. The violet's really adding kind of that shadow effect to it. And I am just adding a little bit more water so it's a little bit runnier. Since the paper is dry, I will be using more paint because the paint isn't going to kind of flow and move as easily. So I'm mixing up just a little bit more. And now I am going to start blocking in the pumpkin. And this is a little freaky because it's not your typical pumpkin color, right? Color and value can be a little bit relative, so it can be based off of what's around it. So it might read as orange, and you'll look at that pumpkin in the shadows and be like, oh, that's an orange pumpkin. But when you actually look at what color it truly is, it's not orange, it's like a red-brown color. Or you'll be like, oh, that shadow's black, but it's not really black, it's like a dark navy blue or whatever. Color is so relative, and it is so influenced by the things around it. So I am just doing this like dark brown layer to start building up the shadows of the pumpkin because it's a little bit backlit. So aside from the eyes, everything else is pretty dark. And I am doing it with this warm brown color to help add that warmth so it reads a little bit more of a pumpkin, even though it's not bright orange. And I'm just carefully going through the mouth. And you can see I'm keeping my brush strokes curved. So all of my brush strokes followed the curve of the pumpkin. And then I start going on the other side of the pumpkin, curving things the other direction. I find that this is a really helpful technique with watercolor because sometimes it can get a little streaky as you are building up your layers, especially if you're doing like wet on dry, so wet paint on dry paper like I'm doing here. You don't have the luxury of having the wet paint or the water in your paper to help that pigment kind of soften. It's going to just stay put, so it can become quite streaky if you are not careful. Now I'm just mixing up some more of that paint because it did not go far enough. And I'm not being too particular on making it the exact same color that was before. I'm just trying to get close. I still have lots of other layers of paint to go. If I noticed it was too dark or off a lot, then I would have adjusted it. Or if I needed to make it a little bit lighter, I could have just added more water. And since I am filming this flat instead of at an angle like I normally work, when I start doing lots of detailed work, you'll start seeing my head kind of poke in at the corner and my glasses because I'm kind of bending over to see what I'm doing and to have a little bit more control. Again, just finishing filling that in. Just taking my time, being careful. It's crazy how much this layer is doing for the picture. Just starting to get those darker values in. All of a sudden the eyes look like they're glowing more, and the mouth, and it starts to look like it's coming together. One thing I've learned with painting is pictures go through ugly stages. It's like you'll be working and it'll look better and better with each layer, and then suddenly it looks worse and you begin to panic and you're like, I ruined it, I need to start over. Sometimes paintings just have ugly stages, and sometimes a few layers that you do make it look worse than what it did before, but they're necessary to get it to look better or more realistic or whatever you're trying to achieve. So when you see something going astray and it's starting to look a little crazy, just keep the faith, keep at it. Worst case scenario, it doesn't turn out, but at least you finished it and you got to use it as a learning experience, right? I found that I learn better by just completing the picture. Even when I'm panicking and I'm like, this is ugly, this isn't how I want it to be, by finishing it, it still wasn't wasted because I still got to learn from it and learn, okay, this is what I would do better or different next time, or this is how I'd approach it, or this is how I would handle this problem if it came. It's a learning opportunity. Whereas if you keep stopping halfway through a picture and throwing it away and starting over again, you never get to move past that stage to learn from it. So I had done another layer of that kind of orangey brown color on the pumpkin, and then I let that dry, and now I'm just working on the stem. The stem is just our phthalo green mixed with some of our burnt sienna to just darken it up a bit. And then I am just taking that green and working it over on the stem. If you look at the reference photo, the area of the stem that is closest to the pumpkin, so the part that runs a little bit more vertically, that is darker than the edges. So I focus the darker color towards that area of the stem, and then I'm just taking a little bit of water on my paintbrush and just diluting out the very end of it. I also just thickened up the stem just a smidge to cover up that area where the color had kind of feathered out. That's why I wasn't too worried about it, because all I had to do was just make the stem just a little bit thicker to fix it. Now I'm taking our Paynes gray, so a nice dark color. So Paynes gray is kind of like a very blue based black color. And then I'm taking our violet. And I'm not even joking when I say every time I say violet, I think of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where they're like, "You're turning violet, Violet." I don't know what's wrong with my brain, but my brain thinks of that every time I say the word violet. But with that tangent, I took the violet Paynes gray and then I added some burnt sienna to it to make this kind of purpley gray color. And the reason why I added the burnt sienna to the Paynes gray and the violet is just to add a little bit more warmth and redness to this color. So it still goes with the other colors that we've laid down. And now I'm starting to darken up these values a lot. And this is a little bit of a scary step because you're like, we're painting this black and it doesn't look right. But believe me, this is how it looks in the picture because of the lighting. Have you ever taken a picture of like you and your friend and the sun was behind you and you took the photo and all of a sudden you couldn't really see your faces because the area behind you was so bright? That's what's going on with our pumpkin. There's a lot of light coming from the back and then you have the light coming from the eyes. And so then it makes the body of the pumpkin be mostly in shadow. Now it's a warm toned shadow, so that's why we've done all these orangey brown layers to add that warmth to it. But it's that same concept. And this is how you get that glowing feel to your picture. Because to make something look like it's glowing or that a light is on, you need to have the contrast. So you need to have those shadows next to the light so the light looks like it's bright. So if you think of like a value scale is where you go from white to like light gray to medium gray to dark gray to black. So if you were just thinking at a black and white value scale, that's what it'd be. With color, it would be like, say you did blue. It would be white fading into the light blue, into a medium tone blue, all the way to a dark, dark blue to black. Okay. And then contrast is the difference in values between two colors. So the highest contrast you're going to have is black and white. So you have the brightest you can go, and then you have black, the darkest you can go, and then all the other colors fall in between those two values. And so if you have to create a higher contrast on something, then you either need to make something lighter or you need to make the things next to it darker. I've noticed some artists will have this issue where they're like, I can't get my whites to stand out. My white isn't white enough. And what's happening is all the values around that white are too light. So those white highlights aren't standing out. Because you can't make it anything whiter than white. So to get your bright highlights to stand out, what they need to do is get the areas around it to be darker to stand out. The same with black. Like if you can't get your blacks black enough and it's not dark enough, then what you can do is make the areas around that really dark area just a couple values lighter, and then that black will read as darker. So it's all this kind of relative illusion that you're creating within your picture. Now we've got our scary skeleton that is looking a little moldy, a little rotten with it being so dark. But I'm just focusing the darker values towards this kind of outer left side of the pumpkin. So by the face, it's going to be a little bit lighter in value because that is where the light is shining through the brightest. You're going to get a little bit of light kind of peering through the skin, even where it's not cut. It's just not going to be as bright. But then as you kind of go around to the left side of the pumpkin, there's not those holes to kind of create some of that glowing effect, and that side is more in shadow. So I'm going to have that side be a little bit darker in value than the rest of the pumpkin. And then I'm just taking my paintbrush and just very carefully going around the edges to really smooth out those edges and kind of define where the pumpkin is. And then right where the cap is. And then I left a little glowing section right around there just so it looks like that's where the top of the pumpkin got cut out. You know, when you cut out the top so you can get the pumpkin, that's why that little bit of a glowing gap is there. And then just darkening up along the base and the left-hand side of the pumpkin. And then I let the picture dry completely. And now I'm coming in with some water and I'm going to add it wherever I want to start building up those shadow areas at the base of the pumpkin. Now it looks like I'm adding color, and that is because I didn't rinse out my paintbrush very well. So it's really allowing you to see where I'm wetting the paper. But I'm just starting to block in those areas that I want to be more wet so that I can add more color and value to those areas. And then I'm adding some blue to that blue, brown, purple mix that we've been using for our grays. And I add a little bit of blue to it and some water to activate it. And now I'm coming in and adding that color to those areas that we pre-wetted. And by deepening up these shadows at the base of the pumpkin and around it, it's really going to add some weight to the picture and make it look like the pumpkin's actually sitting on something and not just like randomly floating in the abyss. Again, keeping those brush strokes a little bit more horizontal, not going up and down as much. And then I'm going to do the same thing over on the right hand side. I did add some water to the above that horizon line, the curved horizon line we have, just because I wanted to add, I was looking at the reference photo and there was a little bit more of a shadow right by the mouth on the right hand side of the pumpkin. So I just added a little bit more color there and then deepened up some of the colors on the table or whatever our pumpkin's sitting on. Then I'm taking Paynes Gray, Burnt Sienna, mixing those together. So it's a lot more violet right now. I've added a little bit of water, and now I'm adding just a little bit more ultramarine blue to it. Then I'm going in with some burnt sienna. And now I'm adding that to our background color. I did add a little bit of Paynes Gray just to blacken it up just a little bit. And I'm putting that in the corners. It's kind of like vignettes, like on Photoshop and stuff where like the corners are darker and then the center is the focus. That's kind of what we're achieving. So I'm bringing in the dark values out from the corner, and then as it moves towards the pumpkin, it gets lighter in value. And I'm keeping my brush strokes a little bit more sporadic and random in this area, just because I want to really play into that smoky fog vibe of the picture. And then I'm doing the same thing on the left upper left-hand corner. So I've added some water, adding some of the paint in there. I did want to warm it up just a little bit so it still reads as like a highlight, but it's not as dark black as the other areas. So I used just a little bit of burnt sienna right next to the pumpkin. And I'm just looking at my reference photo, kind of seeing where the shadows are, where the highlights are, and what things need to be tweaked. When you get towards the end of a painting, you tend to start spending more time looking at your reference photos than you do painting, because you really start to look at what the minor differences between your two pieces and what needs to be adjusted. And that's something that you pick up more easily as you paint. So the more experience, the more you practice this, the more your brain starts to pick up on those differences. Taking some brown, adding it towards the base of our pumpkin. It's these last minutes of the painting that really start to pull this together and make it harmonious. And that's part of the reason why I've been using kind of the same colors in different combinations all over the painting. It's to create that harmony within a piece, because the only color that isn't really bounced around a lot is the green in the stem. Everything else, all those colors show up in other areas of the painting, and I'm just using different combinations of them. So one mix might lean a little more brown, one mix might lean a little bit more purple, and so on. But by using those colors all over the picture, it's creating color harmony within our piece. And I'm just making sure to get really close to the pumpkin on those areas that I want the shadow to be underneath it. That way I don't get like this weird halo effect around it in areas I don't want it to be. Like, I know we're trying to create this glow that's kind of misty, but where we want the shadows at, we want to make sure that those are going right up to the edge of the pumpkin so there's not this weird highlight. That's part of the reason why we did that whole layer of yellow and orange all over the pumpkin, except for where we wanted our brightest highlights to be, was so that it could immediately be toned down in the other areas. Now I'm taking some Paynes gray, and I'm just taking straight Paynes gray and whatever was sitting on the palette, and I am adding that to the corners and on the left-hand side of our pumpkin to really start to push those dark shadows. And again, just following the curve of the pumpkin. I'm using a larger paintbrush for this just to make it easier to block in those areas. And then I'm also doing it at the base of the pumpkin, so where it's sitting on the table. And then at the very top at the cap, I'm just kind of feathering that in. I love this stage in a painting where you can start to see everything come together. It just makes me so excited as an artist. Sometimes I feel like I'm going through like the grief cycle, but instead of the grief cycle, I'm going through the artist mood swings that I cycle through. Like, I go like, this is amazing, I love this. Oh, this is harder than I thought it would be. This looks like garbage. Why am I doing this? Kind of hit despair. I've made it worse. What do I do? And then I persevere through it, and then I'm like, oh, I love this again. This is amazing. And then I just cycle through that multiple times on a painting. And then I finish it, and then I'm all excited. Usually. Sometimes I end on despair, and I have to remind myself that at least it was a learning opportunity, right? Art is not a serious thing, okay? I know people that take art very seriously, and good for them. But I'm not trying to put that kind of pressure on me when I'm creating, because it takes the fun away. If I have to make every painting better than my last one, I will not like art anymore. And so I just go in with the intent to create and see what happens. So now I'm just fine-tuning, tweaking. This is a good stage to take a break and then come back to your picture with fresh eyes to see what exactly needs to be adjusted. Because sometimes if we stare at things for too long, you start to miss the little mistakes or the things that need to be changed. So taking a break is a good way to kind of see those changes. So now that I've added that dark Paynes gray to things, I let it dry completely, and now I am mixing up an orange color. So this is kind of a medium yellowy orange color, but I'm just going in to refine around the eyes a little bit more. Now, one thing to keep in mind with watercolor is that it's transparent. So with each layer of paint, you're going to see the colors underneath it as well, and that will affect the coloring. So each layer of paint is going to make something darker. You can't add more paint to make an area lighter. But by taking this orange, I'm fine-tuning the colors, because as I added that really dark brown and blacks to the pumpkin, it made some of the detail I added around the mouth and the eyes get a little bit more washed out. So now I'm just going in and tweaking up those colors just a little bit. Now I'm taking a little bit more red, and I added it just a little bit to the yellow, but this color is mostly red, not a strong brown. And now I'm just going over the eyes, and I'm just adding it right in that transition area between our bright orange, our orange area around the eye, and the black. So it creates kind of this orangey glow, that reddish glow that pumpkins get, by just adding that right around the very edge, and then on the teeth adding it on a few of the cuts and ridges along it. It's just helping to create that glow effect on our pumpkin. And then I didn't want the cap, the little crack where that highlight is on the cap of the pumpkin, I didn't want it to compete too much with the face. So I darkened that up a little bit so it wasn't as bright as the eyes, because I want you to look at this picture and look like your main focus is looking at those eyes. That's where the focus is going to be. So that's where I have the brightest highlight on the whole picture. And then everything else is darker than that. And then just fine-tuning those lines and details. And we are like 90% of the way done with our pumpkin, 95% of the way there. We're just doing the fine-tuning. Like most people would look at this and call it done. But I'm just going to refine the last few details on it to make it more how I want it to be. And I could have probably spent another hour just futzing around on this picture. My hope is that by you watching these videos in real time and seeing kind of the full length process of it, it gives you a better idea of the process and how I'm painting, because the sped up ones, they move so fast that you don't really learn a lot from them, especially if you're just starting. They can start to guide you, but you don't learn as much. And it'd be even better if I was painting it in real life in front of you, because then you'd have all the drying time and all the in-between that I do edit out, because then it would be like an hour and a half video and you would just be sitting there watching paint dry. And that isn't always the most exciting thing. But I did mix up an even darker color using their Paynes Gray, Burnt Sienna, and Violet to just get a really, really dark color, to just really fine-tune those really dark darks in our picture. Then I diluted it out, and I'm using some of that to reinforce some of the shadows on the base of the pumpkin and the table area. Again, horizontal strokes left to right so that it reads flat visually. If I did the brush strokes up and down, then it would look like our pumpkin is sitting in a field of brown grass. And then on the pumpkin, just fine-tuning those edges and making sure I'm following the curve of the pumpkin so it's nice and rounded so that our pumpkin reads as dimensional. If I did vertical, straight up and down brush strokes to fill in this pumpkin instead of curving them to go around it, our pumpkin would look way flatter. Or I imagine in proper English, that would be, it would look more flat instead of dimensional like it does. Because we're trying to make a flat object, because our paper is flat, it's not curved, and we drew in some lines to draw a pumpkin. So we have to create the illusion that this pumpkin is dimensional, that it's 3D, that you can grab it, that it has weight, it has volume. And part of that is by making sure our lines contour the object. So if it's round, it follows those curves. If it's like a spoon and it concaves, then we draw our curves or our brush strokes to follow a different direction. Okay? So it's just something that comes with practice to know what direction to draw things. If you're painting a dog, you look at the reference photo and kind of see what direction the hair on their face is going to know what direction your brush stroke should go. So just something to keep in mind. And again, it's just something that comes with practice. The more you look at pictures and kind of look at what the artists are doing, or the more you practice and pay attention to what you're doing, the more you're going to learn and grow quickly. And the more consistently you can paint, the better. Whether it's 15 minutes in the evening or 5 hours. You don't have to spend a lot of time to improve your skills at art. So now I'm just taking some red and a really fine paintbrush, and I'm going right on the edges of the areas that are cut on the pumpkin. So right around the eyes, the mouth. By having this like vibrant red right around some of those edges, it's really going to read as like an orange warm glow. And you can see how the opacity of the pumpkin changes when you hit the flesh outer skin of the pumpkin. I don't know if I like using flesh as a term when describing something with art. All of a sudden I feel like I'm reading my husband's like medical journals, or that I'm like a serial killer or something. But again, just doing those final details. And I just really like this picture. The last few weeks I've been painting a lot of Halloween themed things or creating Halloween themed art for my house, and it just makes it so spooky, and I love it, just in a fun, festive way. And then probably around the holidays I'll paint some holiday themed art and switch out the art and have some fun with it that way. Now I'm taking our Cadmium Yellow Light, so our more lemony yellow, and I'm just adding a little bit more of that to the inner part of the eye. I'm still leaving a bright white highlight, but I'm just toning down some of the area around it by adding the yellow. It makes it read as glowing, and then it really allows those areas that are bright white to really stand out. And if I had had more time, I probably would have taken a break about right here on our pumpkin and then come back to it in a couple hours to really see what I would have refined. But I had to go teach, and so I was just on my last few minutes before I had to go do this, or before I had to go finish this painting. Now I'm just taking some burnt sienna and just gently going over the texture of the paper. So this is a little bit more of like a dry brush technique. There wasn't as much water on it, so some of the paint didn't like get evenly coated when I laid the paint down. It was a little bit more speckled, which adds a little bit more texture and dimension to the picture and reads a little bit more as wood. So if you're wanting to try dry brushing, all you do is you make sure your paper's dry, and then when you mix up your paints, just use as little water as possible. because if you use lots of water, that water kind of floods into all the nooks and crannies on the paper and fills it in evenly. But if you use very little water, there's not enough water for it to spread, and so what happens is the paint kind of just skips across the surface and only hits the high points on the paper. So then you get this more speckled texture. And with watercolor, it can be a little tricky to come up with different kinds of textures to differentiate an object. So we've talked about contouring and like making sure our lines are following the curve of an object, and we've talked about value and how value can help add dimension. But one way to separate objects from each other is by changing up the texture. So our direction on our brush strokes with how we painted the pumpkin is very different with how we painted the background. And so those are kind of separated by texture as well as color and value. The base that the pumpkin is sitting on, the table, since the brush strokes are going horizontal, it reads as a slightly different texture, and then by doing the dry brushing, it reads a little bit more rough and textured. So here is the finished pumpkin when it was all dry, right before I headed to class to go teach the class how to paint this. And I'm really excited with how it turned out. You got a really nice glowing eyes, and you've got kind of that mystical background, which was really fun to paint. Anyways, I hope you guys have a wonderful day. And if you like this video, please hit like. And if you want to see more of what I create, please hit the subscribe button and notification bell so you will know when I upload. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.